Miss Mary, friends new and friends old. It's a pleasure to be here. I was a little skeptical about proposing to speak at the end of a very long business meeting. And I was, frankly, even though I've given 10,000 speeches, a little nervous when I come north to speak. Let me explain what I meant. When I was running for Attorney General in the 1970s, I wanted to be the North Idaho candidate. So I would say, well, I was, for instance, at a speech in Sandpoint, I would say I was raised in Lewiston, educated in Moscow at the University of Idaho, spent my summers on Lake Coeur d'Alene, and I gave that very intro. And at the back of the room, somebody stood up and said, "Sorry, Dave, that ain't far enough north." And frankly, there's only one thing worse than getting a heckler, and that occurred to me in Whitebird when I was running for lieutenant governor. We had one of those campaign buses that would come through every once in a while. Always stopped in Lewiston, of course, but we started in Boise, went to Caldwell, uh, stopped in Nampa, came up through Council and New Meadows. And at every place we were to go, we were to give a little campaign speech after we pulled into a designated place at a designated time to be met by the local committee. And the local committee would, of course, assemble and we would give our spiel. Our volunteers would pass out literature up and down Main Street. And it was working like clockwork all the way through the trip until we got to Whitebird. We pulled in. There's an open area there in the center of town, buildings on three sides. And as we pulled our bus in, the volunteers disgorged. We waited for the appointed committee that was to be there. Nobody came. We waited 2 or 3 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes. Nobody came. So the bus driver, an enterprising fellow, decided he would utilize the loudspeaker system that's on top of the bus. And in so doing, he put in a tape of John Philip Sousa marching music, and he turned it on, and the drums began to beat, and the bugles were blaring, and nobody came. So after 3 or 4 minutes, he turned it way up loud. The bugles were really blaring, the drums were really beating. Larry Craig and I were standing out in front of the bus, and after 60 seconds or 120 seconds of that far, down at the end of the open square, there was a mechanic shop with a big door that rolled back, and a mechanic in coveralls came out and stared at us with his hands on his hips. And after a moment, as the music continued to blare, he turned around with his back toward us, slipped one strap off of his coveralls, slipped the other strap off of his coveralls, bent over at the waist, and mooned us. And Larry Craig turned to me and said, "Dave, you better put him down as undecided." So the only thing worse than giving a speech at the end of a long business meeting or too far north is giving no speech at all. Perhaps you want a speech today. I am delighted to be here, and I'll stay here for the benefit of the camera, as I prefer to be a little closer with no impediment between us. But I want to talk today about the tale of two dates. One is essentially lost in history, March 22nd, 1863, and the other is infamous in history, April 14th, 1865. Both occurred during the stresses and strains of the Civil War. Both represent a part of the American crisis, but within that span of 541 days, Lewiston, this city, and Abraham Lincoln were linked together in history in ways that are not fully explored, but are as important as any battle of the Civil War, as important as any event or single event that occurred between those two dates, and represent a bond, a connection that in fact was a significant part of winning the Civil War, in my opinion, as we understand it. The earliest date, March 22nd, 1865, occurred at a point in the disturbance that we call the Civil War when things were not going very well for the Union. Back in Washington on that date, March 22nd, Abraham Lincoln went about his daily tasks as the President of the United States, as the Commander in Chief. One day earlier, just one day earlier, he had given a note to a man named Anson Henry, who was the Surveyor General of Washington Territory, that included the location where we sit tonight. And he asked the Secretary of the Treasury to see Anson Henry with the following words: "Will the Secretary of Treasury do me the favor to hear my old friend, Dr. Henry, briefly about the removal of Victor Smith, the collector of taxes at Port Angeles, who is a negative influence on the administration?" Lincoln, one day before May 22nd, working on issues that related to Washington Territory. 2 days earlier, he had signed a declaration that offered public lands for sale in Washington Territory. 12 days earlier, on March the 10th, Lincoln appointed the first territorial officers for the state of Idaho, including for the territory of Idaho, including William Wallace, his old friend who had been to Lewiston in his capacity as a candidate for the delegateship of Washington Territory. 18 days earlier, early in the morning on March the 4th, 1863, Lincoln had signed the bill creating Idaho Territory, a significant territory indeed, 325,000 square miles, all the way as an expanse from the current border of Oregon and Washington to the borders of Dakota and Nebraska, a landmass area larger than the state of Texas is today. And that bill had contained two very, very significant provisions. Section 6, slavery is prohibited in said territory. And Section 12, the legislature shall assemble for its first session at such time and place as the governor shall direct. Was it likely to be Lewiston? Well, what a bustling and promising place Lewiston had been in 1861 and 1862 when William Wallace, the new territorial governor, had been here. The reported population of the whole mining region, Pierce and Orofino, was about 8,400 people, with about 2,000 people living in Lewiston. They were, of course, maintaining a fiction that no one was permanent resident here because we were on native land and buildings were prohibited, though many structures here had canvas roofs to maintain the fiction that they were not permanent in nature. And what a glorious, promising town we were. About 40 framed businesses or homes, about 20 business structures, 120 tent houses, a sawmill, 2 express delivery services, 2 news depots, 9 doctors, 7 lawyers, 6 hotels where room and board was about $12 a week, A meal was 75 cents and an overnight stay was 50 cents. There were 3 drugstores, 2 jewelry stores, 10 gambling houses in 1862 Lewiston, 25 saloons, and allegedly 20 houses of ill repute. The cemetery at that time had 6 graves in it, and only 5 of those people had died by violence. In February of 1862, we took 2 significant steps toward governance. There was a city council elected with a president, and in the fall of 1862, our forebears here in this fair village formed a committee on vigilance for the purpose of assessing and insisting upon law and order. So was it likely to be Lewiston that would comply with that particular provision, Section 12 of the Idaho Territory Act? Well, Wallace had been here, and he knew the bustling town that we were, although in July of 1862, we were called Ragtown, partially because of those tents and partially because of those canvas tops. Number 2, was it likely to be Lewiston? Yes, Walla Walla, the other competitor, was actually not in the territory as the final boundary had been subscribed. Third, we were the only generally accessible town in the entire territory. We could be reached by water, we could be reached by stage, we could be reached by horse. Boise City was not even platted yet until July of 1863, and some 4 months in the future. And Idaho City was reachable only by saddle and pack train. There was no general delivery of the stage or other access to that mining camp, which was just beginning. Were we likely to be the territorial capital? We were only 465 miles from the Pacific Ocean and at a very noble elevation of 738 feet. And fifth, we were the key to wealthy mineral resources. The mere flakes in the bottom of a gold pan could be worth 7 or 8 cents, and an ounce of fine gold was worth $15. We were the key and the key depot to receive and to transmit those wealth resources. But of course, we were unlikely to be the territorial capital by virtue of a little technical difficulty. Namely, we were not in the territory of the United States, strictly speaking. We were still on sovereign Nez Perce land. We were within the reservation boundaries of the 1855 boundary, and this Capitol building and other wooden structures were technically forbidden. The renegotiations with the Nez Perce were commenced and revised in June of 1863 after the bill was signed, but the tribe was split. Chief Timothy and 2 of his groups approved, but it was of questionable entire tribe assent. And in fact, the Nez Perce Treaty that cleared up the title underneath Lewiston would actually not be ratified by the United States Senate until April 26, 1867. Was it likely to be Lewiston? Well, out in Lewiston on Sunday, March 22nd, 1863, the stern wheels paddle wheelers had been arriving since 1861. In fact, on May 13th, 1861, a captain named White brought a ship named Wright to our confluence, and soon 7 more such ships would begin plying the river between here and Celilo Falls. There was the Spray, the Casadella, the Nez Perce Chief, the Torino, the Okanagan, the Yakima, and the Owyhee, all were running the river. And in fact, sometimes at the dock on the Snake River side, up to 5 such stern wheelers could be found at one time. We were a trading center, we were a transportation hub, and Lewiston, Washington Territory, was quite a place on March 22nd, 1863. You could leave Portland Friday morning, take a first water transport to Celilo Falls, do portage around the falls, and then capture a second paddle wheeler up to the port of Lewiston and be here by noon on Sunday, having left Friday morning. March 22nd, 1863. Perhaps that Sunday, we heard the first steamboat whistle of the season because it was not possible to run the river during low water in the wintertime, and it would always be April or March in subsequent years when the first boat came in. Perhaps that whistle of that boat on March 22nd, 1863, whether it was the first or not, as always, caused people to flock to the dock. They had curiosity. They had commerce in mind. The excitement of new arrivals was always significant, and those boats brought news of the Civil War. On that day, March 22nd, 1863, there was news. Idaho Territory had been created. Now, there was some confusion as to whether Lewiston was in the new territory. The boundaries were not stated in that first commentary. But even so, the excitement that was radiated away from the dock caused us during that day to organize a swift celebration in which 1,000 cannons, 100 cannons were fired here in the valley to celebrate the creation of new Idaho Territory and announce the link between Lewiston and Lincoln that would pretend for 541 more days. Lewiston did indeed fit into Lincoln's plan. Now, the Civil War was obviously a series of military battles. 23 northern states were engaged against 11 southern states. There were some 10,500 military engagements, 150 of which were significant battles. 2.1 million men altogether fought them, and some 900,000 fought for the South. There were 700,000 casualties, and the first shots were fired more than 2,000 miles away from Lewiston, Idaho Territory. We still debate, even in this era, whether the cause of the Civil War was states' rights or slavery. The Pew Research Center in 2011 did a national survey, and they found that some 48% of Americans thought that the Civil War was fought to save the Union or was over states' rights. Some 38% of Americans in that survey thought the Civil War was fought to eradicate slavery, and some 9% thought it was fought to win the war equally for both of those purposes. 12 years ago in a Springfield, Illinois antique shop, I observed on the wall a large framed item that showed me in a rather graphic form what the Civil War really was all about. That framed item hangs in a museum like this in Boise at the Idaho Archives building now. But what it showed and what it illustrated very graphically on a map of the United States was in 3 colors: pink and green and yellow. The pink portion was the northern states, where slavery had always been prohibited. The green portion was those southern states where slavery was allowed and had always been allowed in this nation under the Constitution. And there was a pink rim to the West Coast with California and the state of Oregon being free states as well. But in between those two color masses and just back of and north of the West Coast pink was a large landmass of the United States in yellow. And on that yellow map, as I observed it in Springfield, Illinois, there was even a spot called Fort Boise. But it occurred to me, and it was obvious from that map, that the Civil War, as that map was printed in 1860 as a campaign device to illustrate for the readers and to remind America that the real battle was about the extension of slavery. What would happen in that large yellow mass of territory, unorganized between the pinks and the greens? The cause of the Civil War was this unresolved tension dating back to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 as to whether the institution of slavery would be expanded into the Western territories and the lands subsequently acquired to the original states, or whether it would be forever prohibited there. In fact, that issue was framed precisely by Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln in the debates in Illinois in 1856 over the senatorship, when Douglas, as chairman of the Senate Committee on Territories, was the bold advocate for popular sovereignty. Let the people of the yellow area choose. And Abraham Lincoln, by contrast, thought that slavery was such an inherent evil that it should never be expanded to one more square inch of American territory. The civilization of these great territories, including now Idaho Territory, fit precisely into Lincoln's idea of winning the Civil War by civilization. And Lewiston, Idaho Territory represented precisely that. In December and May 1861 and 1862, Lincoln had signed and created the U.S. Department of Agriculture. May 20th, 1862, he'd created the Homestead Act, which allowed 160-acre allotments. Anyone who would live on them for 5 years and make improvements, pay a small fee, but also had never borne arms against the United States. July 1st, 1862, along came the Pacific Railroad Act. And the combination of the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railroad Act brought enough people west that even here in Idaho, we have ended up with 60,220 homesteads, over 9.7 million acres, some 18% of the entire landmass of what we now call the state of Idaho was adopted initially to private ownership through the Homestead Act, which Lincoln created in 1862. And in fact, there was a notable addition to that. At noon on November 18th, 1895, when 500,000 acres of what had previously been the Nez Perce Indian Reservation was opened up between Genesee and Nez Perce for that kind of allotment under the Homestead Act. July 2nd, 1862, Lincoln signed the Morrill Land Grant College Act, which gave us 33 miles away the University of Idaho in 1889. And in June 19th, 1862, he signed the law enacting emancipation in the federal territories, which read in part, "From and after the passage of this act, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in any of the territories of the United States now existing, or which may at any time hereafter be formed." And that included the territory of Idaho, as we learned here in the Valley on March 22nd, 1863. In December of 1862, Lincoln himself met with William Wallace and Mrs. Wallace, a group of others who were interested in creating an act to split the east and the west of Washington Territory and allow a new territory on that eastern portion. That bill proceeded through the Congress slowly in December, picking up a bit of speed in January. March 3rd, 1863, the last night of the 37th Congress, Lincoln himself was in the Capitol building, lobbying the Senate and lobbying the House to pass that bill. And finally, it did, arguably illegally, after midnight, after the clock had been stopped by the Sergeant of Arms. But nevertheless, Abraham Lincoln himself stayed in the Capitol building of the United States that night until approximately 4 a.m. to sign the bill creating Idaho Territory. And William Wallace, the territorial delegate from Washington Territory, who had been to Lewiston, himself the principal advocate of that and lobbying the House itself, went out with two other men to a little restaurant called Hammark's on Pennsylvania Avenue. And even at that early hour of about 6 a.m., had some of the fare that that restaurant was famous for, champagne and oysters, and went home subsequently, awoke his wife, Luzina, and said, "Lou, you have your territory. It is to be called Idaho, and I am to be its governor." What a way to wake up. And what a territory it was. As I've said, 325,000 square miles. Lewiston was in, however, not everyone was pleased. Some few months later, on March 22nd, 1863, on May 28th of that year, chief lawyer, or Chief Hal al-Hatsut of the Nimipu tribe, grumbled, mused, demanded, "What are we to receive for the town of Lewiston?" Well, Wallace arrived here on July 10th, 1863. Frankly, Lewiston had lost some luster. It's kind of shabby. And the streets were dusty. Many of the buildings were empty. Population was down to 358. And about 9/10 of the people that Wallace had expected to inhabit Lewiston and this region had gone away, many to the Boise Basin where gold had been newly discovered, others back down the river to Portland to disperse to other pursuits. But Wallace rented a building, 20 feet by 60 feet. He agreed to pay $600 a year for it, even though it was an illegal wooden structure, identical to this one. And into that building, he inserted the 1863 and 1864 legislatures of the territory of Idaho in December of each of those years. Wallace himself was elected on October 31st, 1863, to go back and be our territorial delegate. And he took the oath of office and left one day before the legislature convened in this building on December 7th, 1863. Back in Washington, Wallace kept Lincoln informed about the comings and goings and important activities of this place. And in fact, Lincoln could get news after May of 1864 in 3 days as to what is happening in Lewiston, because transit down the river connecting to Portland in 2 of those days could link up with the telegraph, which had reached Portland in that month and that year. And Lincoln did use some of that information in informing the people of the United States and the Congress of the United States of what was going on in Idaho Territory. Every year, just like we have a State of the Union now, William Wallace would deliver Abraham Lincoln, informed by William Wallace, would deliver an annual message to Congress in writing. In December of 1863, Lincoln said this: "The mineral resources of Idaho are proving to be far richer than has heretofore been understood." And he certainly had some evidence for that, for the stern wheeler, Nez Perce chief, had arrived downriver in Portland on October 29th, 1863, with $382,000 worth of gold dust in a single trip. And that gold dust from Idaho Territory, or from our mines up here, and of course, the Boise Basin, would go, in our case, from Portland by steamer down to San Francisco. In the case of the Boise mines, by wagon to Sacramento and then across to San Francisco. And that gold dust from here, combined with gold from Nevada Territory and California Territory, by 1864 and 1865 was being minted into $20 gold pieces at the San Francisco Mint at the rate of $1 million each 2 weeks to send back east to buy the bullets and pay the soldiers and win the Civil War. In December of 1864, Lincoln said this: "The territories of the Union are in a general condition of prosperity and rapid growth. Idaho and Montana, by reason of their great distance and the interruption of communication with them by Indian hostilities, have been only partially organized. But it is understood that these difficulties are about to disappear, which will permit their governments, like those of the others, to go into speedy and full operation." From March 22nd, 1863, till April 14th, 1865, a span of 541 days, the link between Lincoln and Lewiston was unbroken. We fit with Lincoln's idea of how to win the Civil War by civilization. We reported to Lincoln faithfully about that link. We shipped our mineral wealth, and we continue to represent the transportation link, the communication link, and the government link for Idaho Territory to the United States of America during that Civil War. On April 14th, 1865, back in Washington, Abraham Lincoln got up about 7 o'clock. At 8 o'clock in the morning, he had breakfast with his son, Robert Todd Lincoln. Lincoln's usual breakfast: an egg, a cup of coffee. And he heard his son report the event that arguably culminated the Civil War: the surrender of Robert E. Lee to General U.S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. For his son Robert had been there as a member of the staff of Grant. They talked a bit. Lincoln then went back into his office, meeting with congressional representatives at 11 o'clock in the morning, all the way till 2 p.m. He had a cabinet meeting to talk not so much about the Civil War anymore, but about winning the peace, about what we would do in Reconstruction after the South had fully capitulated, how we would stitch the country back together. The great General Grant himself reported on military conditions and continuing operations to the cabinet. Early in the afternoon, Lincoln again had congressional meeting representatives. And then he and Mary Lincoln, for the first time in a long, long while, took a carriage ride along the Potomac. And during that ride, Lincoln said, "We must be happier than we have been. We must enjoy the completion of this second term. And when we're done," Lincoln told Mary, "I'd like to travel to 2 places. I'd like to go to Palestine, to Jerusalem, and walk where Lincoln could walk where Jesus had walked. And he also said to Mary, when it's completed, I'd like to ride on the great transcontinental railroad to California. And I certainly suspect had he gotten so close to his favorite territory, Idaho, he might well have come up the river to Lewiston. Late in the afternoon of April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln met with William Wallace, the delegate from Idaho Territory. He did so because Wallace was interested in filling a vacancy on the Idaho Supreme Court of a man named Sam Parks, who had been here in Lewiston, adjudicated cases here. Parks had resigned and wanted to go back to Illinois, where he and Lincoln had been friends. There was also a vacancy on the marshal's job for Idaho Territory. They talked, and Lincoln explained that he would be glad to accommodate the governor of Idaho Territory, now its delegate. He wrote 2 short notes. And then he said, Old Idaho, because he called Wallace Old Idaho after their battles to create the territorial battle. He said, Old Idaho, come back on Monday and you shall have the appointments as you wish them. Then he said one other thing. He said, how would you and Mrs. Wallace like to go to Ford's Theater with us tonight? We're going to see a play called Our American Cousin. They couldn't go. Mrs. Wallace was ill. But I often think that perhaps at a slow point in that play that night, Lincoln's mind might have wandered back over the business of the day, the meeting with Robert, cabinet meeting, certainly the ride along the Potomac with Mary, and perhaps also, for just a moment, his meeting with the delegate from Idaho Territory and the commissions that were due on Monday. Perhaps he reflected upon Idaho and its territorial capital, a place called Lewiston. Well, out in Idaho on April 14th, 1865, the link to Lewiston after some 541 days was about to be broken. Of course, by the pending demise of the president at 7:22 a.m. the next day, he would have no ability, and we would have no friend in Washington to complete that second term. But secondly, our link was also broken in an astounding way that day. We had continued our legal battle to be the territorial capital after the removal of the seal and the papers. The second territorial legislature, convened December 7th, 1864, had adopted a bill moving the capital to Boise City. The local probate judge had enjoined the removal of the state seal and records. John Berry was obviously a very astute local jurist and did exactly the right thing. On April the 14th, 1865, Idaho Supreme Court Justice was in town. That Idaho Supreme Court Justice reviewed the opinion of the probate judge. He noted that the second territorial legislature was not duly convened. It met in December, and it was not supposed to be convened until January of 1864. The probate judge had pointed that out quite precisely. And the Idaho Supreme Court Justice, Alex Smith, began putting down his opinion in writing. It was issued 3 days later, April 17th, that contained this phrase: the act of removal of the capital was invalid, having been passed by an illegal and unauthorized body. I guess I should tell you that was later reversed by the Idaho Supreme Court on a 2-1 decision. Judge Smith continuing to vote no on June 14th, 1866. But I also want to tell you that April 14th, 1865 represents the last day that Lewiston was the capital of Idaho Territory, or the territorial secretary who had removed, contrary to court order, the seal and the papers from this fair jurisdiction rode into Boise on April 14th, 1865. He went to the balcony of the Overland Hotel in the city, and he indicated that he was there for the purpose of congratulating the city on its status as capital territory. And he said these words, "I feel welcome now. I have got among friends. It's the first time I have felt so since I arrived in the territory." Apparently, we were not very forthcoming. But that act and that speech made April 14th the day Lincoln was shot, the last day that Lewiston was capital of Idaho Territory. Living in Boise City on that day was a man who had been here in December of 1863, Calvin P. Bodfish. He was age 41 when he came here. He was a native of Maine. He had been an exploring young man. He had gone to Australia in 1853, come back to California in 1858. In the fall of 1863, with the mineral discoveries in Boise and in Orofino, he had come to this place, and he was a correspondent with William Wallace, one of the men writing letters back and forth. In fact, one of those letters dated December 23rd, 1864 still exists. He was an active leader in Idaho politics and in Idaho society, and he would go on to die in the same year that Lincoln died, 1865, and though he lived until November 7th, 1865. But Calvin P. Bodfish was one of the men who came to Lewiston, organized the territory, was here through the months of December and January, walking our streets, appreciating our territorial capital. And he came because he was a strong Union man. He came because he was a fine politician, and he came because he was an activist. His obituary, after he died November 7th, 1865, described that after a short walk, he had returned and fallen upon the floor of his office in Boise and expired after a few minutes. The doctor, Dr. Meager, assessed his cause of death as apoplexy, which I think we call a heart attack now. But in Lewiston in 1863, that same obituary characterized his activity as this. While he was here in this town, he wielded a more than an average share of influence, and, said the same obituary, he acquitted himself honorably. This document is Abraham Lincoln's appointment of Calvin P. Bodfish to the position of Internal Revenue Assessor for the territory of Idaho in 1864. This document is a photograph of the original, and this document speaks to us here in Lewiston directly as that connection between Lincoln and Lewiston, because this legislator who served in that Lewiston legislature was the first local man that Lincoln had appointed to territorial office out of the 15 or so that he did so appoint. Calvin P. Bodfish, when he came here, was the kind of man whose obituary would conclude in this way. But it gives us most pleasure to attest his unflinching adherence to the national cause during the darkest hours of the war. No reverses ever shook his confidence in the final triumph of the national arms. And when the enemies of the Republic were most defiant and jubilant, and guerrilla war likely at any hour to be precipitated upon the people of Idaho, his voice was only heard in favor of law and order, the Union, and the old flag. That's Calvin P. Bodfish, a temporary resident of Lewiston, Idaho Territory, in January, February of 1864, December of 1863. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to suggest to you that there was, for 541 days, a strong, necessary, and highly valued link between Abraham Lincoln and the city of Lewiston. It's my pleasure to donate to you this replica, this copy, this faithful photograph of Lincoln's appointment of a man who was true to the Union and true to the Capitol when it was in Lewiston, Idaho Territory. Thanks very much.